Thank you, Joan, for your great service to the earth. And thank you for the knowledge that you have so generously shared with us this evening. Thank you so much. With great respect and with great appreciation, I welcome you all with all my heart. My name is Debra Pearson, and I am retired from a 30-year career as a classroom educator, high school. Thank you. And I live in College Park, Georgia. In 2014, I was resting in my house when I was awakened by literally a rumbling of the earth. I ran outside to witness carnage as my neighbor had begun to clear cut every tree on his property. In order to protect his home, he used my property as his felling ground. And there were over a dozen mature trees that had fallen across my property, destroying a very mature tulip poplar in the process. And I cannot begin to describe to you the stress and the anguish of that day. Out of desperation, I called an environmental organization, hoping to speak with someone who could help me stop the destruction of the small forest that we both shared in our backyard. And a few minutes after that call, I received a phone call from Kathryn Kolb, a compassionate and informed stranger who talked with me by phone for over an hour. There was so much comfort and so much knowledge in our conversation. During the conversation, Kathryn extolled the value of protecting the sanctity of trees on our planet and the necessary and reciprocal relationship between trees and human existence. I got it on a very deep and personal level. Further, Kathryn introduced me to Neil Norton, a Decatur arborist, who came to my side of town, my home, and made suggestions that turned a destructive tree felling event into what is currently a beautiful backyard sanctuary that has evolved into one of the biggest blessings of my life. With Kathryn and Neil as my touchstones, I have continued to expand my knowledge of trees and the earth through dozens of nature walks with EcoAddendum, the organization for which Kathryn serves as director. I cannot think of a more vital organization. EcoAddendum is the necessary voice that promotes balance for the devotees of land development, who do not always consider the role of our great mother, the earth, as the source of both our current and long-term happiness. EcoA creates opportunities that allow individuals to experience the natural world and its gifts, and to share these experiences with others, one soul at a time, one walk at a time. EcoA continues to inspire me to create a life that is very full and worth living. So I introduce again Kathryn Kolb, another human voice for our great mother, the earth, and the director of EcoAddendum. Kathryn.
Okay, yes, sorry. We have the lights on because they're doing some video, so we kind of have to leave the lights up to do that. So I welcome you now to Atlanta's old growth and original forests. And I've kind of come upon a lot of these areas just from doing a whole lot of walking with a whole lot of people. So one of the things we know is that Atlanta is not normal. We all knew that. Most of the world's major cities have been populated for millennia or grew very quickly and densely. Atlanta, though, was settled and built out very recently compared to many major cities, and in fact, most U.S. and world cities. As a comparison, approximately 70% of Pittsburgh's tree canopy is made up of non-native species. Philadelphia's canopy, I recently learned, is about 30% ailanthus. Now, if you all know ailanthus, you don't really want that. We're trying to keep it from invading here. But Atlanta still retains pockets of its original forest, sometimes even in our own backyards. This is a backyard in the city of Atlanta. Most major U.S. cities were settled early as port cities, and they were built out quite densely. So in kind of doing a little research, I just went online to Google Earth, and I took pictures of these different cities, screenshots, but I made sure that the scale, the little 2-mile scale, was the same in each one to really show an accurate comparison. So there's New York, and we have Los Angeles, we have Chicago, and we have Cleveland, and Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Houston, which is a kind of a similar city in that it's a new city in the south, and there's Atlanta. Just for a little extra comparison, at the same scale, I took a little screenshot of Washington, D.C., and I even generously included Rock Creek Park there on the left-hand side. I was being nice doing that, but even so, this is the eastern side of the city of Atlanta. There's my little blue dot where I was sitting on my computer doing this. And then on the western side of Atlanta, there is even more green space. And I think we were supposed to have a little clicker, but there's one, almost all that you see in this is in people's backyards. This is not parks. This is just what we have in the city of Atlanta. There's a tiny corner that's a park, but it's about 1/50th of what you're seeing on the screen there. So why do we still have so much nature? The metropolitan area of Atlanta was an old-growth forest in 1821. That's less than 20 decades ago, and that's a very short. A lot of people here are starting to look at 20 decades like it's not necessarily all that long of a time, because we've maybe had 5 or 6. You can do the math on that. But in the age of a forest, in the age of a forest, it's a very short time. And the reason we have this is a map of the secessions that the Native Americans, when they had treaties, and you can say however that was. I won't make a judgmental comment on that. But anyway, and the land changed hands at these various times. And the coastal stuff, in the 1700s, early 1700s, we had the founding of Charleston and Savannah and Boston and Philadelphia and those kind of cities. And way out here in 1821, our area in the city of Atlanta was an old-growth forest in 1821. And so just a little bit of perspective on that, the amount of time that has passed since 1821 to today is about the same amount of time that passed from the earliest settlements of the coastal cities to 1821. So there's about 150 years of development that was taking place in our major cities that did not occur in Atlanta. For comparison, I just threw this in. This is Seoul, Korea. And I don't think we can find a tree in there. And that's 2,000 years of development. So we're just looking at a scale of time. We're very lucky to be on a young continent. We still have some of this forest left. So one of the things about the city of Atlanta is it built out basically after air conditioning and after roads were the main form of transportation. So the silver lining of sprawl is that the little pockets of the original forest that were left over in the farms and so forth, Atlanta built out very late. This was all farmland way up until the 1950s and so. So because of the sprawl development patterns, kind of the benefit of that is these little pockets of green space. And those pockets of green space that we have left, many of them, more than we realize, are actually remnants of that original forest that Joan is talking about. We're really lucky to have those. So where do we find these places? Steep slopes, almost the single best indicator are steep slopes because these areas were not farmed. They were woodlots. Maybe some timber was taken, but the ground wasn't disturbed. And they were also not considered desirable for building until very recently. Stream corridors with especially narrow floodplains. This is in Low-Water Conservation Garden, a really large, I believe that's an American elm. And so the wider floodplains were disturbed, but the narrower ones often were not. Rocky places were often considered unsuitable for building. Much of the Boulder Park area in West Atlanta had a lot of rocks. There's a lot of nice forest still there. Historic sites. This is over in state champion white ash just off the belt line, which they actually put in very carefully in that area to not disturb the roots. The reason that's there is that was a place that was going to be a memorial park for a Civil War battle, but the memorial went to Kennesaw, and this place kind of got forgotten about. But it wasn't developed and wasn't built for that reason. In our older neighborhoods, most of the houses were built on foundations that kind of went with the natural landscape before grading was common. So in older neighborhoods, this is in Kirkwood, you can find, 150-year-old trees just in people's yards because they built around them to begin with. This is actually in my neighborhood. Someone took down a 180-year-old white oak. It wasn't even that big. At 11 feet off the ground, it was only 2 feet in diameter. But I counted every ring. And you can see the scale on that. It's amazing how tiny those rings are. That tree is 180 years old, old growth, right in our yards. That's like 2 doors down from me. So how can you tell that it's original forest remnant? We talked about the different types of forest. Joan mentioned that. How can we tell when we're looking at one of these special remnant forests? Obviously, really large trees is a good indicator. But there are other things, too, we can look at. Trees that are forest-grown. Forest-grown trees typically grow up without many branches out because there's a canopy. So you don't see many branches on the trunk. They all kind of come out at the very top. That's a good indicator of an older forest. That actually forest, that's in Beecher Hills. There are often trees, lots of our area has been cut at one time or another, but some of those trees put up new stems. So it's actually the same root system. So trees with multiple stems that maybe don't look very large can in fact be an old-growth tree. That's a sycamore with 4 stems. That's one tree. That is one tree. And that's in a forest, Osborne Park, which is coming into the network tonight. Here is another. That's an umbrella magnolia with 11 stems. And this gentleman is standing in the middle. You can see the rim of what had been a huge trunk for an umbrella magnolia. Amazing. I think that would be a candidate for old growth, but it doesn't look like it at first glance. You have to dig around the leaves a little bit to see how all those stems are connected. Damaged trees that were not timbered. We have to give a shout out to Bruce Morton and his family. Those of you who know Bruce was instrumental in working with the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance in helping to save about 400 acres of forest in the city of Atlanta. But in any case, he and his family are posed by one of these relic trees. Yeah, okay, excellent. Good job. All right, good deal. Thank you. Yeah, there he is. Oh, I didn't see him come in. There he is. Hey, oh yeah, take a bow. Take a bow. Yep. Thank you. You sneak in. So welcome. And so this is a very special tree in one of the forests that Bruce helped to preserve, Lionel Hampton Forest. And this is a really large tulip poplar, and it's hollowed out. So probably what happened was it was damaged, and so the last time this area was timbered, the timber people thought it wasn't worth taking. So ironically, much of the rest of the trees were taken, but this tree was left, thinking that it wasn't worth much, and it continued to grow. That's the other side of that tree. So now it's got a canopy, it kept on growing, and it's much older than its neighbor trees. But beech trees, certain species of trees that we find are also indicators. Beech trees grow slowly. They wait to sprout after the canopy is fairly mature. So if you're looking at an 80-year-old beech, you may be looking at a 160-year-old forest. Broad canopy, open-grown trees, we call them relic trees. This is a white oak, and when we see these big, long, outstretched lower branches, it means that probably the area around it had been clear, and that tree was actually left on purpose. People back in the 1800s knew the value of white oak and beech and some of these trees for mast for their livestock, and so a lot of these trees were left, and also shade for houses before there was air conditioning. Rather than being upset that a tree might be over the house, they built under one of these white oaks because they don't drop their branches, and they live for 600 years, and they're going to give you some good shade. Here's another one of these relic white oaks. I think it's the largest one in the city of Atlanta now. I think Eli's here. I think he measured it. He can vouch for it. 66 inches DBH. And this is just on a private property. It's on a slope, on a bank, just left there. People don't even know it's there. Accumulating moss, especially on the north sides of trees. That's an indicator that we're starting to get a little bit of older forest. This is in Fraser Forest. And one of the things you may remember from your history books is when Harriet Tubman was leading enslaved peoples out of slavery to states where there was no slavery. They were, you remember, they felt the north side of the trees to go north. And that was an old-growth forest. We don't have that forest so much anymore. The reason you could do that and find your way at night was because of those huge, large accumulations of those rare species of mosses that we don't really think about on the north sides of those trees. High diversity of tree species in small areas is another indicator of old-growth remnants. We'll have a test on this later, but when you just throw that up there. When you start to see a lot of these in the same area, in small areas together, you know you're looking at one of these remnants. This is a photograph from the city of Atlanta, right? Looks like North Georgia, maybe. The native plant communities are the smoking gun. When we start to see large trees, we start to see landscapes that haven't been disturbed, we also find native plant communities. That's a field of mayapple right there. And you can see it probably wasn't farmed because look at the boulder. So this is another area that probably was left alone. This is coming in actually to the Old Growth Forest Network. It's a Dagnese property with watershed management. Older trees indicate obviously less disturbed soils because if the older trees weren't there, the roots wouldn't be there, we wouldn't have these soils. The soils contain the seed beds and the microorganisms that sustain the original forest. So this is kind of what you might see. It doesn't look so exciting. You know, it's like got some ivy, got a few invasive species coming in it, but on the bottom, there's a little plant. And if you know your plants, you can recognize it, and it's a bloodroot. And that's what the bloodroot looks like when it's blooming. And this is one of the plants that we call indicator species. Orchids are also indicator species. Orchids can only partner with certain kind of fungi. So the only time you ever see orchids is when you have rich, older soils that have these different fungi in them, and the rarer orchids need the older and older soils. So when we start to see some of these type of orchids in our forest, we know we're looking at an older forest. Plants with eliosomes. Eliosomes are a little piece of kind of a fatty material on the end of the seed that ants love them. So when we have species such as the wild gingers, the hepaticas, the bloodroot, and the others, when we find those, we know that ants are transmitting the seeds. The seeds aren't blown by the wind. They're not being picked up carried by wildlife. It means they're not traveling far from that mother plant, which means that we're in an older forest. You see a whole bank of those things, you're probably looking at a 1,000-year-old colony. These are some of the things that we're likely to see. Little wild geraniums, some of our little oxalis. This is in the city of Atlanta, a fairly rare plant called doll's eyes. We don't need to take a test on this, but here are some of the plants for you plant people that you might find indicators of the original forest. This is a property where we're seeing the trees are actually smaller, but it has a great deal of plant diversity. So it means the trees are probably timbered, things are coming back a little bit, but the ground wasn't disturbed. And so I'm going to bring you to the next statement that you will be surprised to come from my voice here. Cutting trees is not the worst thing for a forest. The worst thing for a forest is destroying the soil. So this is what's going to take out your forest, and it's not going to be able to come back. And when we only do this a couple of times, and we have a lot of trees around, we can probably manage that. But what's happening more and more is that these things are starting to be connected. We have more and more of these larger areas. And when we have things like this, we're really not going to get that forest back. You can even see, this was an old-growth forest in Tucker, you can even see the different color of dirt up at the top that shows that that was the original forest. So, you know, we don't necessarily have to do a lot of grading when we're working in building neighborhoods. This is an old-growth tree. In my neighborhood, there's houses, there's a garage like 2 feet from that tree. It's perfectly healthy, it's fine. It's been there for 150 years at least. And when we look at it, we're looking at the soils. This is a way of sampling soil. Usually you get horizon, where you have a little bit of topsoil and then immediately it goes to red clay. That was rich, old dirt, 18 inches down. And no, it's not going to work. In the previous slide, it was right in the critical root zone of that tree. So why is this important? Original forests with intact soils and high biodiversity have the ability to regenerate themselves. We can't do it. Only they can do that. But then the older growth forests are the ones that are also going to give you the best ecosystem services for your buck. It's going to give you the best amount of stormwater prevention, the best human health value, and I encourage you to read in your packet. There's a series of human health values that forests were just beginning to understand that. Simply walking out in the forest, breathing in the air, there are all these chemical compounds that literally make us healthy. It's going to give you the best biodiversity value. Obviously, it's the highest aesthetic value, and it's at the lowest cost. And unlike built structures, a living forest infrastructure actually appreciates over time. So in dividing these types of forest into 4 different categories, so we kind of understand that we have a virgin forest, which is an uncut forest. These are small areas, maybe some individual trees. They're very rare, but we do have some in the metro area. The original forest is an impacted area, but it retains a lot of old growth character. They're uncommon areas, but they're more than you'd think. They're very important, and many of these are going to be going into the old growth forest network. Native forests are found in many areas. It's still very uncommon for a major city. That's where we have a little bit more disturbance, but most of the trees are native. And then we have non-native landscapes. These are the areas where the soils have been most disturbed, heavily farmed or graded areas, usually created after the 1950s. So this is an area that is a forest. This is part of Atlanta's tree canopy. But it's been graded. It's growing back up in a lot of invasive species. This is not going to give us green infrastructure value, anything like this, also in the city of Atlanta, in Beecher Hills. So there's a vast difference in terms of forest type. And tonight we're celebrating our older and original forests. This is our organization. These are some of the things that we do. Please join us on walks and other activities. And I'll end on some great books, as we're going to bring our panel up in just a moment. So you can take a moment to look at some of those. Obviously, wonderful books by Joan Maloof. Some other really, really fabulous books that I hope that you will enjoy reading if you haven't read them already. Thank you.